I was standing outside my own front door with a positive pregnancy test in my coat pocket, a card that said Daddy in my purse, and his favorite takeout going cold in my hand, when I heard my husband's voice through the wood, saying words that would end my marriage before I ever got the chance to tell him we were having a baby. And the second voice answering him, low, familiar, achingly gentle, belonged to my own sister. My name is Marisol, and what I heard in the next 2 minutes rearranged the rest of my life, but what I did in the 3 weeks that followed is the part nobody expects. Because I didn't scream. I didn't kick down that door. I stood there, frozen, and then I did something far more dangerous than confronting them. I said nothing at all. 3 years ago, I was 31, running a small interior design studio out of a converted loft on a quiet street in Charleston, the kind of business I'd built from nothing but a card table and stubborn hope. My husband, Silas, was 34, steady, dependable, the sort of man friends described as solid, the sort of man you stop double-checking because you've never had a reason to. My younger sister, Juniper, was 28, freshly divorced, and had been living in our guest room for almost 8 months while she found her footing again. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I loved my sister without complication. I trusted my husband without hesitation. For years I never had to hold those two facts up against each other and wonder which one would break first. Juniper had always been the fragile one, the one our parents worried over, the one I stepped in to protect whenever life knocked her down. So when her marriage fell apart, I didn't think twice about handing her a key to our guest room. Silas didn't hesitate either. Family takes care of family, he told me, and I believed him completely. For months, the three of us moved through a strange, quiet rhythm. Juniper cooked when I worked late. Silas helped her file paperwork, fix her car, drive her to interviews. I remember telling my best friend Odessa over coffee that I felt lucky, genuinely lucky, to have a husband who cared so deeply about my family. Odessa went quiet that day. I didn't understand why until much later, and by then, understanding wouldn't be enough to undo anything. There were small moments scattered through those months, moments I noticed and then talked myself out of noticing. A laugh that lingered a beat too long. A conversation that stopped the second I walked into the kitchen. One evening in early spring, I found them sitting close together on the porch steps, Juniper's head tilted toward Silas's shoulder, both of them quiet in a way that felt strangely private. When I asked what they'd been talking about, Juniper answered almost too fast. Just work stuff. Nothing interesting. Silas nodded along without lifting his eyes. Something in my chest flickered that day, small and cold, and I pushed it down deliberately, because I didn't want to become the kind of woman who watched her own family too closely. I understand now that the flicker I silenced that spring was the truth arriving early, knocking politely at a door I wasn't ready to open. It would come back. And next time, it would not knock politely at all. Silas and I had been married 5 years, long enough to settle into that comfortable, occasionally unremarkable rhythm most marriages find. We built everything from a cramped 1-bedroom apartment, working our way slowly into the house on Ashgrove Lane, the house where I now sat frozen on the porch. I remember those early years fondly, weekend trips we couldn't quite afford, nights he stayed up late helping me build sample boards for clients who hadn't hired me yet. I need you to know I didn't imagine any of that. It happened. Which made what came later so much harder to hold, because a betrayal like this doesn't erase the good years before it. It only teaches you that good years and a good ending were never the same promise. And I was about to learn exactly how far apart those two things could drift. The pregnancy wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwanted either. Silas and I had circled the idea of children for years in vague Sunday conversations, always pushing it to after the studio stabilizes or after we pay off the second car. When the test came back positive on an ordinary Tuesday morning, I cried for 10 straight minutes, not from fear but from a joy I'd been almost too afraid to expect. I told no one that day. I wanted Silas to hear it first, in person, with the kind of small ceremony you imagine when you're a little bit in love with your own life. I bought his favorite takeout. I bought a card that said Daddy on the front, feeling faintly silly even as I paid for it. I sat in the driveway a moment longer just to breathe, savoring the last few seconds of a life I still believed in completely. That's when I heard their voices through the door, and I assumed, for one merciful second, that it was only the television. It wasn't. I recognized Juniper's laugh first, low and familiar. Then Silas, quieter than I had ever heard him speak to me. I stood there on the porch, keys still in my hand, and listened to a conversation that unmade 3 years of my life in under 2 minutes. "She's going to be devastated," Juniper said, and there was no shake in her voice at all. "But it has to happen before the house refinance goes through. Once that's done, splitting it gets complicated." "I know," Silas answered. "I already talked to a lawyer. If we file before the refinance, the house counts as separate enough that we can negotiate the split without dragging out the equity fight." He kept going. "The studio, my studio, the one I'd built with my own hands, he said he wouldn't touch. He just needed the house, and enough from our joint accounts to start somewhere new. Somewhere I wouldn't know to look." I stood there with a cooling takeout bag in one hand and a positive pregnancy test in my coat pocket, listening to my husband use the word us to describe a life that did not include me. Juniper's voice softened into something that almost sounded like tenderness. "I never meant for this to happen. You know that, right? It just happened slowly, and then all at once." "I know," Silas said. "I feel guilty every single day. But I can't keep pretending I'm happy with her when I'm not. You make me feel like myself again." I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I did none of the things you imagine a person is supposed to do in a moment like that. I just went very still, the way you go still when the floor beneath you has been quietly rotting for longer than you knew, and one wrong step will send you straight through it. Then, without a sound, I turned around, walked back to my car, and drove 2 miles to a gas station, where I sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour staring at absolutely nothing. And in that silence, something in me started to shift from grief into something colder, sharper, and far more useful. I want you to understand why I didn't walk back through that door and confront them right then. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't weakness. It was arithmetic. In the space of one overheard conversation, I'd learned 3 things. They had already spoken to a lawyer. They were timing everything around my house refinance. And they intended to take resources out of our marriage while making absolutely sure I never saw it coming. If I burst in that night, I'd be reacting from raw shock, with no proof, no plan, and a pregnancy they didn't even know existed yet. Sitting in that gas station parking lot, I made a decision that would define the next 3 months of my life. I would not let anger cost me my future, or my child's future. I would gather everything I needed first. Then, and only then, I would let them see exactly what they'd done. What I didn't know yet was just how much more there was to uncover, and how much closer they'd already come to disappearing entirely. That night I went home and performed the hardest role of my life. I put the unopened card away in a drawer. I told Silas I'd already eaten so he wouldn't wait up. I asked Juniper how her job interview had gone, and I listened to her answer with a smile fixed on my face while something inside my chest quietly rearranged itself into something colder and far more focused than I had ever felt before. The next morning, before Silas woke, I called Odessa and told her everything in a whisper, standing inside my own closet with the door shut like a woman hiding from her own house. She didn't say, "I told you so," though I think some part of her wanted to. Instead, she asked one question that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Do you know what accounts he has access to, and what he doesn't?" I didn't. Not fully. And that gap in my knowledge became the first project of my new, secret life. Over the following 2 weeks, I quietly built a complete financial picture of our marriage, using nothing but information I was legally entitled to as a co-owner of every account involved. I pulled statements online. I read through the refinance paperwork Silas had left carelessly in a drawer, never imagining I'd bother reading it closely. What I found stopped my breath. He had already met with a lawyer 3 weeks earlier. Juniper had been quietly added as an authorized user on one of our joint credit cards, a card Silas had opened claiming it was for emergency household expenses. And there was something else, something Odessa had suspected but I hadn't wanted to believe. This wasn't the first time my sister had crossed this particular line. Through a careful, gentle conversation with our mother, I learned that Juniper's marriage hadn't ended the way she'd told everyone for months. Her ex-husband hadn't left her for someone else. She had left him, for another man, A relationship that quietly collapsed within months, leaving her needing somewhere soft to land. That somewhere had been my guest room. My mother mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Juniper had done something disturbingly similar once before, years earlier, with a close friend's fiancé, though nothing had ever fully come of it beyond a few uncomfortable months and an eventually mended friendship. At the time, our family had called it a youthful mistake, the kind you forgive once, assuming it was a lesson learned rather than a pattern only just beginning. Hearing it again now, in the middle of everything unraveling in my own home, something in me shifted permanently, and I understood I had spent years defending a pattern I'd mistaken for a phase. Odessa became something closer to a second spine than a friend in those weeks. She sat with me on the nights I couldn't stop replaying that porch conversation, searching for a version of events where I'd noticed the warning sooner. She reminded me that noticing something late doesn't make a person foolish, it makes them human, and that the only real failure would have been noticing and choosing to do nothing. She helped me find an attorney. 2 weeks after that night on the porch, I confirmed the pregnancy and received a due date, sitting alone in an exam room, thinking about the fact that Silas still had no idea, and that when he finally learned, it would be entirely on my terms, not his. I hired a family law attorney named Rosalind, recommended through Odessa's cousin, a woman with a reputation for being calm, exact, and completely unshakable at the negotiating table. At our first meeting I laid out everything, the overheard conversation, the refinance timeline, the credit card, my sister's living situation, my pregnancy. Rosalind listened without interrupting once, and then said something I have carried with me ever since. The people who plan quietly usually forget that silence works both ways. Over the following month, with her guidance, I made a series of careful, deliberate moves. I paused the refinance application, citing paperwork that, technically, I was now the one generating. I restructured my design studio's accounts, always solely in my name, to remove any ambiguity Silas might later try to exploit. I documented every dollar that had moved through that joint credit card since Juniper had been added, building a clean, undeniable paper trail. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork at all. It was continuing to live inside a home with two people who believed, completely, that I still had no idea what they were doing. Juniper kept cooking dinner some nights. Silas kept kissing me goodbye in the mornings. I smiled through every single one of those moments, grieving the life I'd believed in only weeks earlier while quietly building the one that would replace it. One evening, our mother came for dinner, unaware anything unusual moved beneath the surface of that ordinary table. She mentioned, almost in passing, running into an old neighbor who'd asked about our refinance. Silas's fork paused mid-air for half a second, so briefly I doubt anyone else at that table noticed. Juniper changed the subject instantly, asking about a recipe. I sat there passing a bowl of vegetables to the two people quietly planning to unravel my life, and understood exactly how skilled they had both become at performing normal. It steadied something in me. If they could perform this well, I decided, I would learn to perform better. Later that same week I nearly gave myself away. I was reviewing bank statements at the kitchen table after Silas had gone to bed when Juniper walked in for a glass of water and caught me before I could close the laptop. She glanced at the screen and asked lightly, "Budgeting for baby stuff already?" I forced a laugh, told her I was checking a client invoice, and she accepted it without pushing further. My hands didn't stop shaking for almost an hour after she left the room. Because the truth was closer to the surface than either of us knew, and what I discovered only days later would change the entire shape of what came next. 3 weeks into my quiet preparation, I discovered Silas hadn't just been planning to leave. He'd already begun transferring small amounts from our joint savings into a new account opened entirely in Juniper's name, an account I hadn't found earlier because it wasn't linked to either of our primary financial profiles. I only found it because Juniper, careless in her comfort, had left a bank confirmation email open on our shared family laptop. In under a month, they'd moved just over $10,000, money I had quietly earmarked in my mind for our baby's future, into an account meant to fund the life they were building without me. That same week, I received an unexpected call from a woman named Wren, a co-worker of Silas's I barely remembered from a company holiday party. She'd overheard him discussing an apartment search in the break room, describing a 2-bedroom unit across town, ready by the end of the following month. She said she almost hadn't called, unsure it was her place, but something about how casual, how already settled he sounded, had bothered her enough to pick up the phone. I thanked her, hung up, and sat with a strange, uncomfortable gratitude, learning that even people outside my marriage had noticed what I was only now allowing myself to fully see. This wasn't a plan still forming. It had a start date, a location, and a life already half-built on the other side of a door I hadn't opened yet. I brought both discoveries straight to Rosalind. She explained that funds transferred out of joint marital accounts in anticipation of separation could be treated very differently in a settlement than either of them expected. Far from giving them a head start, that money had just become the strongest piece of evidence in my case. I spent several more evenings organizing a year of invoices and tax records, grateful, for once, that I had always kept meticulous books. And then I chose the moment carefully. A quiet Sunday evening, both of them home, the kind of ordinary night that had made up so much of the life I was about to end. I asked them both to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where Juniper had once helped me address our wedding invitations. I placed 3 things in front of them: a printed bank statement, a copy of the refinance pause request, and a small, folded ultrasound photo. "I know," I said. Just those 2 words, quiet and even. I watched something collapse behind Silas's eyes, the particular horror of a person realizing he had underestimated someone completely. Juniper's face moved through several expressions in a few seconds, none of them landing anywhere near remorse. "Marisol, I can explain," Silas started. "You don't need to," I said. "I've already heard the explanation. I heard it 3 weeks ago, through the front door." I told them everything, word for word, watching the color drain from both their faces as they understood exactly how long I had known, and exactly how much I had built while they believed I was still oblivious. I told them about the lawyer I had already retained, the paused refinance, the separated accounts, the documented transfers Rosalind would present as evidence of financial misconduct. Juniper reached for sympathy, said she'd struggled with guilt for months, that things had simply happened. I let her finish. Then I told her what our mother had told me, about the real reason her marriage had ended, about the man she'd left her husband for months before she ever moved into my guest room. I watched her realize that the story she'd used to earn 8 months of shelter in my home had just been permanently rewritten in front of the one person whose trust she could never fully repair. "You knew this whole time?" Silas finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long?" 3 weeks and 4 days, I said. Long enough to hire a lawyer of my own. Long enough to know exactly what that account under Juniper's name was for. Long enough to know our daughter's due date before you ever thought to ask if I might be pregnant at all. The word daughter landed harder than anything else I said that night. Silas's composure finally broke completely. Juniper reached for my arm, saying my name softly, the way she used to when we were children and she wanted comfort after a bad dream. I stepped back before she could touch me. "Don't," I said. "You don't get to comfort me out of the wreckage you built." Neither of them said another word as I gathered the folder and walked upstairs to pack the first of my bags. I moved out 3 days later and stayed with Odessa while the legal process unfolded. What followed over the next several months was not fast and not painless, but it was fair. The documented transfers and the timeline Rosalind had built became key evidence, and the final settlement let me keep the house, with retirement assets divided in a way that fully accounted for what had been quietly taken. My design studio remained entirely mine, untouched, exactly as it always should have been. Silas's career took a quieter hit than the marriage itself, and the promotion he'd been counting on never came. Our mother, upon learning the full truth of what Juniper had done, made a decision my sister never anticipated. The door that had always been open to her, quietly, permanently closed. 2 sisters who had once been inseparable simply stopped appearing in the same room, and no one ever demanded a second explanation. I gave birth to my daughter 7 months later, with Odessa beside me instead of a husband, holding my hand through every contraction with a steadiness I hadn't known I needed until I had it. I named her Avellini, a name that belonged to no one else's story but ours. 2 years have passed since that night on the porch. My studio has grown enough to employ 2 more designers. I own my home outright, its walls filled with my daughter's drawings instead of memories I have to carefully step around. I haven't spoken to Juniper since the day I moved out, and I've made peace with the fact that some relationships don't get restored. They simply end, and the ending becomes the boundary that protects you. Silas and Juniper did eventually marry. I learned it secondhand, without any particular reaction at all, and I've thought about that quite a bit since. I expected the news might reopen something in me. It didn't. Whatever they built together, they built on a foundation neither of them will ever fully trust again, because it began with a lie whispered through a door, and lies like that don't disappear once they've been spoken. They just wait quietly for the next person who gets too comfortable believing they're the exception. I think about that porch often, standing there with a cold takeout bag and a card that said Daddy on the front, listening to two people I trusted more than almost anyone in the world plan a future that erased me from it entirely. My silence that night wasn't surrender. It was the first move, and the only fight that ever really mattered, the fight to make sure my daughter and I walked away from that betrayal with more than either of them ever expected us to keep. So I'll leave you with the same question people ask me when they hear this story in full. If you found out your husband and your own sister were planning to build a life together behind your back, would you have stayed silent that first night the way I did, or would you have opened that door immediately?